When you got the job, was there a particular brief you were given to try and, we want you to do this, this and this, or was there a particular thing that you said, I want to do this, this and this? What were the kind of goals you set for yourselves?
Well, at interview, no, I didn't have. I didn't put forward, these are the things I want to do in this job. I responded to the job's description,
Yeah.
which was very broad, and I think let's look at the sort of historical perspective. The fact is that Scottish Arts Council. Am I looking at the camera, by the way? You.
Look at me.
In that interview
Yeah.
manner, yeah. The Scottish Arts Council had actually only been independent for what, 4 or 5 years. The split between what was Arts Council of Great Britain, which then funded what was called Scottish Arts Council, but they were still under the aegis of Great Britain. That changed for Scotland and Wales and England. That changed in, I think, 94 or around about that time.
And what year did you start the job?
I started the job in 98.
Wow, okay.
And
Yeah.
Shona Reid had become the director of Scottish Arts Council, I guess probably on that change point,
Yeah.
or thereabouts, and was a new broom in many ways. And we were also, I started the job the year after the vote for devolution.
Devolution, because I think
That's a huge benefit.
I think upcoming potential independence is another interesting context. So that was a big change then in the political structure.
Well, independence notwithstanding, the fact is that devolution changed things quite considerably, and I came in literally, before they actually opened the Parliament, or maybe, they opened the Parliament. The actual kind of the procession down the Mall, down the Royal Mile, was in June '98, wasn't it?
Okay. Don't ask me.
And by then I was just about in post, and ironically, I had not to be there on the day of the procession down the Royal Mile. I would love to have seen that, but because of previous commitments, I had to go somewhere else at that time. That was a significant change, and I think maybe we should talk about the context of when I was at Scottish Arts Council, as it was then, was a newish broom in Shona Reid. The whole cultural movement towards devolution.
So previously it had been a budget from London?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't
Wales
realise that
are
at
the
all.
same.
Yeah, I didn't realise that at all.
No, it was called ACGB, Arts Council of Great Britain.
And
in
Scottish
fact-
Arts Council was a sort of a regional office of that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Quite independent, sort of. They kind of got on with their own business, but under the same basic structure
Yeah.
and same governance. And so that's quite a difference in itself. And you can see in Wales and in Scotland how things have changed, partly because of that independence and partly because of devolution. Devolution meant that, as with so many other things in Scotland, that the whole build-up to the vote and the decision to devolve was a build-up of Scottish identity and confidence, and I'd relate it much more to that bigger cultural shift. A very happy one, I think.
Yeah.
That, of course, was accompanied by a sense of musical identity, which is vested quite clearly in traditional music, as it should be, as it must be. And they've been a really powerful force, and I think that had filtered into some of the spirit of jazz players and stuff. And I think, so when I arrived in my job in Scottish Arts Council, actually at the interview, Shona Reid said to me, "Why are you applying here? Because you come from England, you've been working in England." And although I had connections in Scotland, I knew people like yourself and lots of others, and and had worked in Scotland, was doing some work at the time actually in Edinburgh for the City Council. She said to me, "Why are you applying for this job here and not in England?" And I said, "I wouldn't even think about applying for England because the circumstances are so different. I like the fact that the Scottish Arts Council at the time, and less so as the years went by, especially after Shona had gone, but at the time, heads of art form, plus the finance director, plus the education director, plus the director, were the senior management.
Right.
So actually, And I remember saying, and that was changing by that time in England. Senior management were kind of out of the art forms. They might have been artistic people, but they were out of art form specialism. Whereas actually in Scottish Arts Council, until the big change, and Creative Scotland, the heads of art form were senior management, and that made a big difference.
Yeah, God.
It meant that the work that, in inverted commas, the arts were at the top table in the arts funding body.
Yes.
They are no longer either here or in England.
Borough Council in lots of places.
Extent in Wales.
In lots of places that's happening.
Yeah.
Apparently.
And it happens in other places in Europe too.
So can I ask a question? Like, were you? I know your background was a lot of work in the jazz and improvised music field. Were you perceived as? But you also worked at Bath Festival and.
So I was acquainted across the board fairly well with music, but not at all a specialist in things like understanding orchestras. I certainly had no orchestra experience or opera.
So when you came into the job, did you feel like you were perceived as a guy coming from a jazz background coming into how did the classical people see you?
There was a bit of that, and there always is and always has been. And I do remember somebody from an opera company not far from where we were sitting saying to me, you just want to spend all the money on jazz festivals. And I said, for God's sake, do me a favour.
Yeah.
The job was across music.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about, so in the job, I was given a lot of free range by a director, by Shona Reid, who said, well, you're the expert on music, we want to know what should be done. That's why we...
Yeah.
So some people might have seen me as some jazzer, but some of the more kind of straight people thought that, and even the folkies thought that, until they realised that actually, A, I'd worked across lots of kinds of music, and B, I was interested in the whole, if you like, the equity of opportunity across music.
Yes.
So actually, one of the things I'd done, one of the things that Shona Reid prompted me to do, I don't think I took it from my own bat, but she prompted me, and it took no time to get underway and take the prompt, was to look at the whole business of what we'd now call, indie rock, in inverted commas, popular music, and so we actually began to, my kind of philosophy, and it was well accepted in the Arts Council, was that, it's a simplistic thing, it's all music.
And were you, there'd obviously been, speaking to Matthew Rick, your predecessor, there'd obviously been a huge shift already in his tenure, and he was also from arguably from a jazz background, he was a jazz bass player. So was there were you aware of that? Yeah. And the history of it when you applied?
I knew Matt Rook, and I'd known him. He used to be at the English Arts Council before he moved to Scotland, or moved back to Scotland, and yes, I was aware of that. But I was also aware of the fact that he had been completely and utterly bound up with the endless crises with Scottish opera, and had been even when I arrived, he was still finishing off yet another review and all that kind of stuff. And he'd been able to shift things to an extent, but I suspect he'd say he hadn't kind of been able to shift things far enough. And there was that constant tension, so that the philosophy of it, for me, was not everybody should get an equal share of the money, and 10% for you and 10% for jazz and 10% for folk and 10% for opera, but that actually, in an ideal world, whatever monies were available will be distributed according to the relative necessities of the sector. And quite clearly, an opera company is a more expensive beast because it employs 200 people and orchestras and choruses and so on. So actually we want that, but that may cost X, but a jazz festival might cost less than X, a third of X, but that third of X is the important figure, not the in relation to figure. And there was a lot of discussion about that. And Sheena Wellington was interesting about that, from folk music, because she was passionate, obviously, about developing the opportunity for folk music. But she was saying the same thing. It's not about fighting the other musical or artistic genres. scrabbling for a pot of money and nicking bits of it. It's about working for what we call equity of opportunity. Now that's a fine sentiment. I'm sure Matthew was feeling that, and I was feeling that, and Ian Smith would have been feeling that, who came after me as the director, the head of music. But doing it is a different matter, and slowly shifting bulks of funding was quite a different matter. So I think the principle was there, but the practice was very, very slow.
I'm just making some notes. I'm not texting my kids. Okay.
So, for me, the movement of activity started much more with traditional music. Now that was something that was clear when I had the music budget, and here's another difference from today. The music department, the drama department, the literature department, not only in our Arts Council but in England and in Wales, had their own budgets.
Right.
So when it came to budget time, it was down to me and my colleagues to try and work out how much we spent out of the music budget.
Yeah.
And then we'd also bid for a bit more in our own budget. And then there'd be lottery money, which came along sort of round about that time or just before that time, which was open to all. But, but in terms of our own direct budget, which is treasury money, taxpayers' money, not lottery money.
Yes.
We had a music budget.
And when you were at the time, there was quite a lot of discussion around how much of that money went to different genres.
Yes, and that's where I came in.
Yes.
And at that point, almost all of the money went to that broad sweep of music that we call classical.
Yeah.
And
the national bodies were still inside the Arts
national
Council?
bodies were still till way after I left Scottish Arts Council.
Right.
They were still within our.
So you were responsible for all the national bodies.
Yeah.
Which was
the
Scottish
orchestras,
SNO
and SCO.
SCO.
Yeah.
Is that the three?
Yeah.
National bodies. Okay.
Yeah. And there's ballet, but that was in the dance department, of course.
Right. Okay.
But then they had the ballet's biggest contingent of labour was a 50-piece orchestra. So.
But they were still under the dance budget.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So. Yeah.
And
So
do you remember what the percentages were if you cut
I
them
don't
up?
remember percentages, but I remember ridiculous. I mean, completely out of kilter. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
It was 90+% went to classical.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember. I'm not very good.
I
at
remember it being
percentages.
something like that. You know.
Yeah, very much so. But here's the thing: the jazz budget, the element of the budget that was jazz music, that went to jazz music, was, I think, almost exclusively the money that went to assembly directors. They then were.
Yeah.
For their various activities, which included, Queen's Hall gigs.
So year-round stuff and festivals.
Not at that time. They weren't doing all this their festivals at that time.
Right. Okay.
More importantly, I thought at the time, and here I am, an Englishman from South London, turning up to a country that's just voted to devolve, if not to go independent. And I was gobsmacked at the impoverished level of money going to traditional music.
Yes.
And I thought, well, the first thing is, this is Scotland.
There was virtually none going to traditional then. Was that what?
There were some money was going through what was called the combined arts budget at the time, which was like art centres and those organisations that did community arts, but not with a specific music or specific art form remit. Jim Tuff was the director there. He's really great at all that. But so one of the organisations being funded through that budget was Fashion and Gale.
Yeah.
Which was obviously firstly a Gallic enterprise, and then it was music but other traditional arts, but mainly music, let's face it. And they were being funded not through my
music budget.
I mean, you think of how much they were doing, it's amazing, really.
Yeah.
And they had a champion in the people who were the community arts people. In the music budget, there was £40,000 for traditional
No
music.
way.
And out of a budget of, God, I can't remember how
It was
much
millions,
it was.
though.
It's a long time
It was
ago.
millions.
Millions.
That's unbelievable.
And Dave Francis was in the middle when I arrived of doing a kind of a review and research that was paid for, I think, out of that 40 grand to see what the scope was. So Matthew Rook had set that off, which is great.
Yes.
So I arrived and I thought, this is ridiculous, a country whose entire musical identity rests with traditional music.
And it's world class as well. It's incredible.
But was behind the door when it came to that world recognition. Ireland had a much stronger recognition for its traditional music at that time. So anyway, I think I put a lot of effort and energy into trying to concentrate on that. And of course, with the new devolved government, and with people like Rona Brankin, who was one of the culture ministers, we had about 5 culture ministers in that period. I mean, it's a complete.
Did you spend a lot of time with politicians?
A certain amount, but I didn't need to spend much time with people like Rona Brankin because she said she worked as the culture minister and voting more money towards traditional music. So they kind of shifted more money into our budgets. So from 40 grand, obviously I tried to rework our budgets to an extent, as much as I could.
But you had to cut stuff to give folk traditional music more money.
To shuffle it around, but people came and went as funding bodies and everything. And at that time we were in a fairly good circumstance that even basic taxpayers' treasury funding was increasing. And of course, the point about devolution is that the subjects, the devolved areas of responsibility, meant that the Parliament, both here and of course in Wales the same, had more time to concentrate on things that had been, relatively speaking, marginalised by the Scottish Office and by Westminster, so that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in England, in Westminster, undevolved are the issues of the media and broadcasting, communications, huge areas of, like dealing with the BBC and stuff. Whereas, so the Culture Ministry is a sub-ministry of DCMS in Westminster, and that's dealing with England as well as dealing with the undevolved issues across the UK.
Yeah.
In the Holyrood Parliament, culture was a devolved issue and was something that people could really concentrate on, and that was really healthy.
And it was also a big way for a new. It was not exactly a new nation, but a new political. To build a whole movement. Yeah. So there was lots of forces aligning,
and there was no problem at all with either any parties in terms of the recognition of the importance of culture.
Sure.
That was a good thing.
Yeah.
And obviously, of course, the SNP would be batting for traditional music.
Yeah.
But then so was the Labour Party. So
but you also had, I guess, you also had like real talent there too as well. I mean, there was a lot of. The music, the folk scene was very exciting at that point, and so was the jazz scene. To be fair, there was stuff to work with,
and so was the indie scene. So those things helped, and then lottery money, and because Cable was a recipient of some of the lottery money. It meant that people could come up with new propositions that weren't going to be regularly funded because we couldn't do that with lottery money, but actually you could pitch up with some quite a heavy duty project and get money for it specifically. But that wasn't going to be regular funding. I remember having conversations with you trying to find out a way of. But I mean, you were in record business, which in itself was a difficult business.
Let's go on to that a bit later on.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting to sort of mapping out the landscape that you've just done, and it's important. And so the picture was when you arrived that very little money goes to traditional music, but there was all these sort of zeitgeist forces pointing towards traditional music.
And
so how did you actually? What was the things that you did? That you who got the money? What did they do? How did it go? In that first phase,
I think I spent one of the things I was able to do, and people in my sort of position, whatever art form and whichever country were able to do at that sort of time, was actually be in the sector much more. We weren't tied to our desks assessing.
Does that mean in a bar?
Time. It probably means in a bar. Cheers. No, it means being out there talking to people.
Yeah.
And there's no question that has shortened down simply because in all countries, I'm not just.
You mean
talking
since
about
then? Since then?
Well, and since the recession really, and governments across, have had to cut back on Arts Council funding and so on, but also governments, including this one, have insisted, as they do with other public services, discuss right or wrong, that there's this thing called frontline delivery. In other words, the grants have got to be much greater than the administration costs.
Yeah.
You know that in the health service and all that.
Yeah.
And what we know about that is that people make things happen, and actually people are the cost.
Yes.
And in Arts Council terms, me and my colleagues in our department, and it was nice to have other colleagues with skills and different interests and different specialities, were able to be out there talking to people all the time, and having the kind of meetings that you and I had probably lots of, and many other people, and kind of being part of a scene. And all right, we were the other side of the table in terms of funding, but we were very much wanting to see the prosperity and the development of the music scene or the visual arts scene. And I think that's
changed. That's
been constrained, not because of the people, but because of the funding available, and they've been.
But hasn't there not also been I mean, would it be correct to say, from what you've just said and what I know, that you were given a lot of opportunity and authority to shape what the music department did? You had your own budget, and you could target funding as you saw fit.
Tom, that's exactly
so you could actually have a strategic approach
within all kinds of circumscriptions.
You had lots of constraints, but you could actually say, let's put a bit of money here to do this.
Let's give you an example.
You were very active. You were able to be active.
Yes,
proactive,
proactive, and actually strategic and making decisions, right or wrong. But I mean, we had mechanisms like advisory groups, and it had to go up. To senior management. And
you weren't a Donald Trump style authoritarian dictator, but
I've got the haircut.
But you had a lot of.
I was allowed to lead from the front in terms of proposing. There was a music advisory group, obviously a panel, and there was obviously council, which had music people involved. But I was able to put forward things or to make things happen. Now, that's the fundamental shift between then and now, and again, it's all three arts councils, because, by the way, for reasons I still don't know, the Northern Ireland ACNI Arts Council was always independent, was never part of ACGB, and that may be political, I don't know, but anyway it wasn't. But the three arts councils have all shifted from strategy, from budgets and strategies for art forms, to some kind of political social engineering strategies. So if you look on all the websites and all their kind of, their aims and objectives and their criteria and everything, they cut across. They may be good or not, as the case may be, to discuss. But the fact is that there are no kind of specific statements and strategies. So
it's like, it just depends who applies and what applications come in.
They cut. Well, there was an Arts Council senior person in music who said, Arts Council England, who said to me, we don't give grants. She said, we receive applications. In other words, there's a kind of an idea that
it's become completely passive.
It's not passive really, because behind the scenes they're making decisions on why give this or not.
Well, they're making decisions on who they give money to. But I remember you when in your era, there was a fund just for jazz, certain kinds of jazz projects.
Yeah,
and you were
I mean,
able to target,
yes, I know.
funding
I don't
at
think-
specific sectors.
And you're constantly trying to change that. There is that same sort of targeting that happens within the arts councils now, but it's given generic titles rather than art form titles. So it'd be, digital development, and you can be doing it in visual arts or in poetry for that matter. But it's
But they've moved away from focusing on art form specificity.
They've not only that, there are
Or
no
even
such thing as
genre
there's
specificity.
no art form budgets.
Yeah.
There is not a music budget
which is
in Scotland.
a huge change.
I think it's a huge change, and the argument was, and I remember
So did that come in while you were there?
it was coming.
Yeah.
I kind of escaped. I been saying to people this weekend actually, I think I had the best of it. I had that kind of independence, independence of Arts Council, devolution. Let's all go for it, and a time of.
It was a golden era, Nod.
It was. I think
The land of Nod.
there's no
We
such
still
thing
call
as-
it.
There's no such thing as a golden era, as we all know. But it was a good time, and we hadn't hit this flipping recession, and we hadn't. And yes, it hadn't been. Partly, the whole change was about lottery being the people's money, and therefore we could no longer say, we're going to give it all to opera or to jazz or whatever. We had to be kind of completely democratic. That opened up things for
Classical.
classical arts. I mean in the wider sense.
So,
Those things that had previously been accepted as art.
the lottery meant that you didn't have to cut classical to start funding folk and other things.
That's right. It meant that everybody could pitch up.
Yeah, but
And-
are you saying that the lottery introduced this sort of genre-free, sector-free, give the money to the best application approach?
Yes,
and then
that was
people
the-
liked it.
That was the whole idea, and governments liked it. Whether or not Arts Council liked it is another matter. And then
Why do they like it? Because it's uncontroversial. You say it's not my decision. We didn't decide a strategy. It just depends on what applications come in.
Yeah. In other words, we are not introducing a strategic prejudice into decision
It just
making.
depends on who
Good
applies.
application comes in, but then
Is that the big reason for this walk away from strategy? Is because you can't. It's not our fault, Gov. It's not my fault, Gov. If you know what I mean.
I don't think that's a bit negative. I don't think it's that. I think there is a positive, which is, it's the people's money from lottery, and so actually, it's the best project that should win. But it's also that there are criteria, and much more about reaching numbers of people and and outreach. And the Arts Council in England, and indeed I think the other arts councils, are more and more conscious of the fact that somehow they've got to reach out and kind of cover the whole population and the whole territory. And there's a book published recently by a man called Robert Hewison, who talks about a kind of a golden era in terms of funding coming through, which is essentially the Blair period.
Yeah.
And that includes obviously the devolved places, but nations. But and he talks about the opportunity that all that funding gave, and the missed opportunity that was because every single Minister of Culture, or especially, and he actually talks about England only in this book, which is one of the shortcomings of the book. But he only talks about England, and he talks about the fact that every single time an arts council or a ministry made a movement, then there was some kind of fluctuation of political thinking and a new minister or a new government perspective on something, and all of the cultural people just jumped and said, "Oh yes, we'll do that.
Right.
We'll do that. We'll do it. Oh, arts and health, arts and this, arts and that. Oh yes, we'll prioritise this. Oh no, we'll prioritise something else." There was a terrible kind of knee-jerk reaction culturally, and I think in English Arts Council particularly, to anything political. And you've got to remember that although not now, in 2017, but until recently, the chief executive, the boss of the Arts Council, not the chairman, but the chief exec, was an ex-civil servant who was used to doing the yes minister will tell us what you want, minister, and we'll put into operation, rather than it being an independent voice for arts and culture. And to an extent, the fluctuations of politics have made a lot of difference. And because in Scotland that concentration on the devolved issues is greater at the Parliament, actually you've had just the same kind of response. So lottery funding is for all, and therefore everybody has to have a go, and we can't prioritise opera, or we can't prioritise folk music or poetry, or indeed this, that, the other thing. What we can prioritise is coverage and access and engagement across the board.
Okay, I mean, I think we could talk about this a lot longer because it's really interesting. But I'm kind of interested to. There's so much stuff we've still got to cover. So I'm aware of the time. So, what were the things that you felt in your era you're most proud of and getting done, and what were the things that really pissed you off that you didn't get done, and why?
Well, I think that the if you want a list, a kind of a checklist, I did, even though I wasn't really that involved in what that whole broad area you call contemporary popular music, indie music, rock music and so on. I was pleased that I actually kind of set the stage for that being accepted as one of the many
that gets funded
parts of music and art form. So even though I loved it, Simon Frith, who's a good chum, but he described me in print as or described our policy as being it looks as if it was written by a kind of one of those vicars who wanted to be cool with the kids. And I thought that's fair enough actually, but he was also very generous at saying, well, you're opening the door to this music. You're saying this. You're saying there is no longer a thing about art and then other music. It's all art. The question is, do you like it and is it good art?
But the other argument presumably is that not necessarily indie music, but popular music had these massive commercial companies,
they're not
developing talent and promoting it.
There was no naivety about this in the.
So it didn't need money.
In the document we wrote, we said it's only where the public funding. This is
a very nasty exploitative industry, but there's an industry there exploiting talent.
Yeah, but there's also a lot of talent not being funded or only not being helped by the commercial industry because the industry is very partial.
Yeah.
And the argument as with any other public funding, this is kind of what you think needs to be refocused. The argument is, why is public funding there? Why is subsidy there? To bridge the gap. If something is worth having, it's to bridge a gap between commercial viability
and quality
and just to
but
help
the concept
make
of quality
that
is still an elite concept, isn't it? Somewhere along the line.
Oh, it's not even about. It's about not just about quality, it's about provision.
Right.
So, for instance, with lottery money especially, you started having all these kind of like workshops for young kids playing rock music or indie music, and your DJing and things like that.
Yeah.
So the money's not just going into the elite; it's going into people doing it for themselves.
Okay, any more successes that you want to list?
Well, the Youth Music Initiative was something that
that was a big one.
I was knocked out by that, and it came from an odd angle.
It's quite an interesting story how that started.
It's a complicated story, and I don't think I won't go into it. But
no, I'd like you to tell me about how it arrived on your desk.
Okay.
Is it true that it was made up in the back of a car?
No. Well, everything is made up in the back of a car.
Like a thick of it type.
There was a bit of that. Oh no, that
like Jack McConnell.
No, that was the final announcement of the money was done by sort of press release. But by God, they'd nailed down the money.
Yeah.
Never mind all that. They'd nailed the money and they'd set the stall out. The government, which is great. It came about. Oh God, I'll be quick about this, but English Arts Council voted money to a thing called the National Foundations for Youth Music, which wasn't national because the English art, because the Westminster government hadn't realised that this devolution had occurred. They voted 10 million quid, but it's only for England. 10 million quid lottery money across England for youth music to start regenerating things where the local authority music services had failed and so on and so forth. But it was only for England. They realised that quickly. But the people running Youth Music, National Foundation Youth Music, hurtled up to Scotland and talked to the Scottish executive very early in the day, very early in devolution, and then talked to other people in Scotland saying, well, can you give us another million? And we all went, we just had devolution. We're not giving an English organisation money to then come back and spend in Scotland. And we had a bit of a tussle.
Yeah.
But the tussle ended amicably in that Christina, who ran the National Foundation for Youth Music, and I bumped into one and I said, of course we want to do things in youth music in Scotland, and yes, we'd like to access an equivalent sum of money. Like if you got 10 million for England, we could get a million for Scotland. It'd be bloody marvellous.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to do this from a Scottish perspective. So the first thing we'll do is Arts Council and National Foundation for Youth Music and actually the Musicians Union.
Yes, and the RSMD.
Yeah, well no,
wasn't there an audit?
We were the funders, and we put together a pot of money to fund the RSAMD, as it was then, the Royal Conservatoire. Stephen Broad and Celia Duffy to lead, and a guy called Dave Price, who's a fantastic organiser.
What's going on?
To do a big research. So tell us.
It was very well. It was very smart the way that happened.
Fantastic.
I don't know who did that, but it was incredibly smart.
They did it. We oversaw it.
Were you one of the brains behind it?
I was with Christina, and actually the union put in a bit of money too. We paid for that. We briefed RSMD. We contracted them, and we oversaw the process. And by the time it came out, they had a really good initial picture of the music sector, formal and informal, schools and non-schools in the whole country. England didn't have that. We had that.
Yeah, it was very compelling. It was like a lot of docs in a really good row.
It's fantastic. And it was a really good piece of work by them.
Yeah.
And yes, I was very proud of having been but we thought this was going to be an advocacy document we had to really work on. Before it became public, before it was published, we had contact from the executive, the civil servants, who were our kind of liaison people, saying, First Minister's really interested in this project. God bless him. Yeah. And don't publish it right now. We say, well, we want to get it published. No, don't publish it right now. Yeah, it's an advocacy. Yeah, the advocacy is kind of working. Don't worry. Yeah. And so we held on a little longer, and we launched it with the funding,
wow.
Which was 2.5 million year one, 5 million year two.
It was 14 million altogether.
And 10 million year three.
Yeah.
And then it has
continued 17 million.
And it has continued since then at 10 million a year.
But there was this there was this P6 target.
Yeah, well, the back of you said in the back of the car. It wasn't in the back of the car. It was.
But there was an announcement of it, wasn't there? And
it was a typical piece of politics. The civil servant was phoning me up day after day. Well, we're kind of 10 million. I'm going amazing.
That's as much as England's getting.
Well, that's right. It was.
But it's much bigger.
It was 10 times as much as England got per capita.
Per capita, yeah.
But some of it, a lot of it went to local authorities.
Yeah.
Which in England it didn't. Nevertheless, the local authorities were still.
It was still ring-fenced for music.
They were better in Scotland, the local authorities in general, than they were in England at that point in terms of music. But no, the denouement. Just the night before me and Ian Smith and Christina Coker and Jack McConnell stood before the cameras with the copy of the report and with smiling children and shiny trumpets in a school in, I forget where it was, Motherwell, I think, and that was his constituency. I was at 7:30 in the evening. I was still reading emails from the civil servant saying, "This is what we're going to say. This is the press release." And one of the things was, because it's a target-driven government, as all Blairite governments were, they had to have a target, and the target was all children at age by P6 would have had 1 free year of music education. And I kept saying, you know what? You haven't worked this out. And yeah, but that's what the minister wants to say. And I'm thinking, for 10 million quid, he can say what he likes.
Yeah.
But the reality was, we did a piece of work afterwards.
Well, I remember I was on the steering group.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and there wasn't even enough money to do that. If it was instrumental lessons.
Yeah. Well, so what we worked out was, you would have to train more teachers because there weren't. And in the Western Isles, there was no music service.
Yeah.
It was the only authority out of 32 that didn't actually have a music service and hoped for the best.
Yeah.
Some music services were well on, fantastically good. Some were really behind the door. So the day of that launch, I then went on to a meeting of all the music services with the education minister. Perhaps I shouldn't say this. I'm so grateful that money came through, and it's been well spent. And then and Greater Scotland are still using it and developing it.
Yeah.
But I did go to a meeting with all the music local authority advisors and the education minister at that point, and the education minister didn't know anything about it. And I had to answer questions at that meeting.
Wow.
Because the local authorities thought all the money was for them, and with no strings.
Yeah.
And yet we set up some strings because we wanted that money to work. But the P6 target we worked out, if you had to train all the teachers necessary to do all those lessons, it would cost you 30 million and not 10 million. But, you know.
But there was also, do you remember there was a brilliant moment on a steering group, it was a couple of years in, and I think pretty sure you were still there, when someone from the government said, it's by the start of P6, not by the end of P6.
Exactly.
And, then, and that hadn't been clarified. And then it turned out that the first 2 years, a lot of people missed the target because they thought it was by the end of P6.
Yeah.
And there was all this gulping around the room. It was hilarious.
However, that's all that Malcolm Tucker world.
Yeah.
But the real world is that £10 million.
Oh, it was massive.
Was added.
Massive.
I tell you what, I got a big pat on the back at the Arts Council. It wasn't just me, but I'm pleased that I was part of pushing that forward.
Yeah. Well, I just want to tell you one story about that. I was talking to a guy from one of the local authority music departments who said to me, this is a direct quote, "For years we've been praying for manna from heaven. Now we're up to our fucking necks in manna. We're completely drowning in manna, you know?"
And what was interesting is that a lot of the local authorities then turned to the existing organisations like yourselves, but also like Fashion and Gale, to provide this music education. And the National Youth Choir of Scotland, huge amounts of work in singing. It
drove a lot of change, rapid change and innovation. And
I'm very proud of that. And do you know what? When Darren Henley, 10 years afterwards, wrote the National Plan for Music for England, which is now operating, and the Arts Council are now giving out the money to the music hubs in England, and there's a lot of good work in that, and everybody appreciates that movement. There was not a single reference to Scotland, and I'm still, you have to, you'll know, as somebody who was, comes from an English background, despite your Scottish, everything about you is Scottish. So
how could you mention?
But the English view of Scotland is still so distorted that they don't even think to ask. Yeah. And then it's like
all that experience and knowledge.
So you're asking about
other things that you're proud
achievements.
of. Yeah.
Showcase Scotland, which is what we're visiting this weekend. When I was still, as you know, because we're in different funding jurisdictions, I was still able to do a bit of programming for the Bath International Music Festival, which I'd worked for before as a freelance. And I did ask the permission of both the festival and the Arts Council, Scottish Arts Council, if I could carry on doing that work, sort of holidays, weekends, and in my spare time. And they said yes. I was still programming, but we'd had 5 or 6 years of a big invitation program for overseas European jazz promoters to our Bath Music Festival Jazz Weekend.
Yeah.
And we'd done that more or less kind of ad hoc. We'd had some help from various funding bodies, Arts Council and various others, and PRS and so on. But it wasn't part of it wasn't a kind of a strategic goal of anybody's or a fun. We just pieced together bits and bits of music and ran the festival, but just invited lots of people to it. And it was based on the way in which the French jazz organisations had got cultural money to keep inviting people to promote their own music, of course, to other countries. So we've been doing that in Bath for several years, and when I was here, and all this thing about traditional music, with Celtic Connections being so fantastically strong.
When did that start? Because must have started around the same time.
No, earlier than that. I was still in England when it started.
Okay.
But it
wasn't that long ago.
But the Showcase Scotland, the showcase elements of it didn't exist. And I proposed it to Colin Hind, who ran the festival.
That's right.
And to the British Council arts officer at the time, and they thought it was a good idea. And I said, well, I've kind of got that sort of experience, and not just here, but I've been invited to lots of other showcasey kind of things, and I said, well, again, having control of a budget, I was able to give there was lots of set pieces and then a bit of flexibility. So I offered a grant to the opportunity to get a grant to the showcase, and they did it a couple of years, and it took a while to evolve. But for me, I mean, it is one of the most successful showcases in the world at the moment. And everybody is beating a path to their door. It's only 3 or 4 years ago that friends and colleagues in England managed to even persuade the English Arts Council to come up with a few quid to start something like that, and they're not regularly funded or anything.
Yeah.
Again, the lack of understanding in England about what is successful in other countries has been, I think, quite spectacular. And if this is going on YouTube, this is the death sentence for me in terms of working.
Your career's over, Nod.
Well, unfortunately, I've still got a long way to go and a lot of money to raise. But I am constantly disappointed at the lack of that connection.
There's knowledge and experience.
But anyway, I mean that's my prejudice. Maybe it's a different situation in England. Blah 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 blah.
So any more on the success list?
Well, the jazz thing is something that, in a way, I was very disappointed I couldn't do more, and I think I was conscious, being such a dyed-in-the-wool jazzer myself, that actually that would look like a huge amount of kind of, tilting of kind of preferential treatment. But your projects with Caber, I think we managed to kind of fund various things, and in the end, the record industry is a different beast, isn't it? But you certainly gave profile to. When I arrived, Glasgow Jazz Festival had gone through that terrible period of a kind of virtual collapse, and people were working very hard to try and regain it. So I helped to build up a bit of funding for that. Towards the very, very end of my time in this job, before I went back to Bath to work for the festival, we brought together that kind of big meeting of jazzers in Stirling.
Yeah.
In my attempt to say, well, I remember saying, come on, chaps, come on, it's all there. And what I remember saying is, look at the examples of the traditional music people. They've got their act together. You need to do that.
Yeah.
But I think I was disappointed that I wasn't able to make more of a.
Is it okay to talk a little bit about the? Because I remember my memory is that you tried to commission a review with Pete Luxton, which would have provided a sort of.
It might have done
a context in which Caber could have sat that meant it wasn't being seen as a record company,
and it kind of it kind of petered out. That it didn't go in.
Literally and yeah.
It didn't. Yeah.
It just didn't happen.
It didn't. Well, yeah. Pete came up with some ideas and some, but no, the time wasn't right. I don't know. Ironically, it's the kind of review thing that I've been doing, as a consultant myself. But you also know that sometimes those reviews go nowhere. And it does happen. I've written reviews that go nowhere, and I've written reviews that people take up, cudgels and recommendations, and off you go. But no, that was an unsuccessful attempt on our part to focus the jazz, and maybe if we'd have somehow engineered that better, we could have got to it quicker. But yes, that kind of went into a bit of a...
And what about the sector for the sector? So the Scottish Jazz Federation came out of this, as far as I remember, trying to replicate the traditional music forum for more.
Yes.
Well, no, was that
was after I left, because
but the first. I'm pretty sure the first meeting was you'd set it up.
The first meeting.
Yeah.
Was right at the end of me being at the Arts Council, and I think by then I'd actually already got the job and
we knew you were leaving, but the first meeting was still still there.
Yeah, and it was chaired by Michael Connaughton.
Yes,
who was the MP for Stirling at the time. Sadly lost his seat in the wipeout.
Yeah.
But a strong jazzer, and I think still the chairman of the Scottish National Jazz Orchestra.
Wouldn't be surprised.
And a good chair, and a very good chair.
Very good chair.
Politician.
Yeah.
And
very
so
nice guy.
And brought lots of people together and had kind of conversation. The other thing that you were talking about, achievements, something that I think was well achieved, but actually completely got wiped out in the Creative Scotland turnaround, was the touring programme.
Yeah, the tune-up.
Yeah,
that was amazing.
Which had some of the elements of the English
was that lottery
music network. Yeah.
Yeah.
You see, I was able, that goes back to, being at the top table. We made bids. There was lottery money available. There had to be things that were additional. Well, of course, touring always is. But I made the bid within our overall context of all the art forms, and we were all kind of putting forward ideas that we wanted to develop in our different art forms. And I thought that touring was something that was actually quite light, especially touring stuff that wouldn't otherwise manage.
Yeah.
And also, and I remember you were in the one of the bands. We also tied up with the English Contemporary Music Network.
Yeah.
One other small thing. So I mean that was great, but I went and actually the management, long gone from Creative Scotland, wiped that project out.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say, which is a shame, because I think we need some touring structures. And we do in England, by the way, just the same, and even in Wales. And now it's all individual tours that you hope you might get a bit of money for the tour you want to run, but there's no
building infrastructure.
No. So I was pleased with that, but it disappeared.
One of the things that I'm really interested in focusing in on for this last part, it's really interesting to hear you talk about how you had control of the budget. You were able to be strategic. You were able
to an extent.
So you had a bit of wriggle room there.
Yeah,
you were able to
sort of main
you were able to push some money in different places and see where the need was and try and start some new ideas. Blah blah blah. You were able to bid for things inside the Arts Council for money out of lottery and all the rest of it for good ideas. Now, for me as a musician on the other side, the things started to change in terms of this, what I see as a flight from strategic thinking and a sort of delegating strategic thinking out into the sectors was with the sector forum process. So was that something that was a decision higher up, or did it kind of happen? How did that?
There was various people writing reports about how to restructure arts councils, and when James Boyle became the chairman, he was a great one for kind of shuffling all the cards and shuffling the deck chairs and stuff.
But he led the thing into Creative Scotland. But before we get into that, because I think that's really important historically, is that thing about setting up sector forms, because it happened in jazz and it happened in chamber music as well, didn't it? I think.
Yeah, a bit on helping. Yes, but that again, the chamber music was after I left, and the jazz thing was something that I kind of prompted people at that. In terms of my career here, at the very end of my career, because I believe that actually the interest groups should actually collectively work together and to network together and the strength in that kind of proposition, because the Fashion and the Tradies had shown that very strongly.
Yeah.
And there's no reason why other sectors shouldn't do the same thing.
Well, there are, but we'll come on to that later.
Well,
there are reasons why it's much harder for other sectors to do it. They're much more fragmented. They're much more loggerheads. So to ask them to come up with a strategy is less realistic than it's like the traditional sector. The economy was a bit bigger. They're more united. They had some leadership. People like Simon and Dave, etc.
Yes and no. The traditional sector, when I first arrived in Scotland, as if like it made any difference I arrived, but I was surprised at the fact there was a lot of backbiting. They were fighting one another. The Fashion didn't like Celtic Connections, and Celtic Connections was at odds with Sheena Wellington. You name it, all of that. Sorry, Sheena, if you're watching it. I'm sure that's not entirely true. There was a lot of factionalism and a lot of angst, about the Arts Council as well. Within a short space of time, they began to realise that there's a collective interest here.
You said earlier people were important. There were important people in that sector that led that unification. And they were very smart.
Like Arthur Cormack and Sheena Wellington
and Simon Timmer.
Absolutely, very much so.
Yeah.
Who were open and generous and and more embracing, and learnt not to worry about the infighting, and indeed not fighting the rest of the sector. Like I said, I remember Sheena saying, we're not against Scottish opera, we love singing. A different kind of singing. Let's not bash them. That was not the case with some of the other bits of the music sector. However, it was about people, and I think. Let's talk about the jazz sector, because I think it's really, we've never really kind of gone down that route. There were people who had funding who were not engaging with the rest of the sector.
Yeah. Who should remain nameless.
Who should remain extremely nameless.
But we know who, I know who you're talking about.
And we know where they live. But no, I really think it's important. There were those who were in a position to maybe galvanise a collection.
Well, there were quite a few people like that. I mean, everybody was working on their own, really. And it was a feature of the jazz sector.
Well, I'm beginning to think there is an element of that, and it's almost an element of the music. When you think about folk music, is our music, as it were. Jazz music is my personal music. Yeah. So there's a bit of that. But listen, people can do it in other ways, and through that time, I was still with my other hat on. I was still beavering away sort of privately with people on the European Jazz Network, and that's been a massively successful activity, and I was really pleased to be part of it.
Yeah.
And when I got the job at Scottish Arts Council, they were patting me on the back. Well done, becoming professional in terms of attitude about these things, so that we weren't fighting each other. We were trying to work as a block.
Sure.
And there have been several of the people who should have been significant in being leaders, and if I think, shall we say, about what happened in Holland many years ago with the creation of the BIM and the BIM House and everything, people like Willem Breuker, who was a very distinct improviser, a distinct avant-garde musician, was a leader of the sector and helped the sector to come together to create the BIM, which is the
and also had Huub van Riel, who was not a musician, but very charismatic and very skilled,
and they had that leadership. So they were from the sector, but they had that leadership.
Yeah.
There was not that kind of one or two people coming together and saying, let's sort out. There was still a lot of factionalism in a very small scene, and I think subsequently the Scottish Jazz Federation, when it did get underway, it took a long time to get underway, and then it continued to be buffeted by that kind of either factionalism or lack of engagement by people who should have engaged.
But it was also, I think that's true, and I was there. But it was also that some of the, I mean, it actually comes back to what you said at the beginning about equity of opportunity. And if you've got established organisations with established infrastructure who are getting sizable funding already, they're in a position as mature organisations to take opportunities. And whereas I felt our sector was always under threat, and the organisations that were there were not really able to be generous.
There's kind of a social and emotional understanding. Forget about music or jazz, but actually that's the way people under pressure and in fear and isolated.
They were in survival mode.
Yeah,
they're in survival mode. So there were instances of ideas being proposed on the Scottish Jazz Federation, which suddenly appeared in grant applications by organisations on the Scottish Jazz Federation, which was a disaster because it meant they were nicking ideas for their own applications.
So what you're looking at there is a lack of maturity, both in the people who are developing things and in the scene in terms of its own self-confidence. That's where the traditional music
was different
set up, because they are now thoroughly confident that this is Scots.
Well, it was their time. They had, but I think there was a whole bunch of. I think it's really interesting to look at. There's a whole bunch of facts,
but well-grounded, mature, thoughtful, determined and committed people who slowly but surely coalesced into a group.
And it was a positive spiral rather than a virtuous circle rather than a vicious circle.
I mean, I would, not here and not now, not on tape, but I would, point the fingers at a few people who should have known better in the jazz scene.
Sure, and I was one of them, but it wasn't just.
No, you weren't actually.
It wasn't just about the people. It was there were structural forces that made it a different. In
the end, people have got to if we believe in the thing that we're trying to put forward, whether it's a political party or a jazz scene, we've actually got to try and coalesce and there's got to be a kind of a let's forget the differences, because the similarities are stronger. And here's the thing. Yes, I called a meeting, and kind of facilitated that meeting before I left. Hold on a minute, I had to call that meeting. Why weren't meetings being called that hold me into question? Yeah. Whereas in traditional music they were doing it, and I was joining in.
But if you try and light a fire, you put a match under one fire, everything's really dry. You just go. Woof. If you try and light a fire with wet paper or damp wood, it doesn't quite take.
There was too much damp.
There was too much
damp wood, and as a funding body, it was very difficult, because despite all the kind of strategic this, that and the other thing, as somebody, I think, trying properly to be responsible with a lot of public money, I couldn't simply sign off an application and say, well, ignore the fact that it's a kind of rubbish application, let's give them a bit of money. Yeah. There's some flexibility in giving credit, also a bit of leeway. But it was very, very difficult to direct the funding in such a way, because the one thing I couldn't do is create an organisation and then say, come and ask for funds. What I could do is help to fund and support organisations going forward. And I mean, we did that to an extent with CABRA, I think, with lottery funding, and tried to help Glasgow Jazz Festival get slightly back on the rails, because they came off the rails with that in the sort of mid to late 90s, didn't they?
So what happened?
There was no organisation that actually could come forward and wanted to come forward and say, look, there's a networking and a sector development role here, and we've got a role as, shall we say, as a festival or as another kind of organisation, but we can take on that role, and Yeah, and would do the work to actually establish that role. So
Yeah.
Scottish Jazz Federation had to be invented from zero, whereas an evolution of an organisation that could have taken on that kind of role didn't happen. One of the things that I always thought was, in its stronger times, Glasgow Jazz Festival could have been the development organisation, because it had a once a year remit to run a festival, but had the rest of the year to do other things. That might have happened, except it was more or less, it collapsed itself in the late 90s or the mid 90s. So again, there weren't the people there to actually make that happen at the time when it could have done, when the money was available, when Glasgow had the money, let alone the Arts Council.
But the other big
there was
thing,
nobody else coming forward with that kind of, that broader perspective. I would have really loved there to have been something like that. And at one time, I felt that maybe Cable could have done that, but I think you were doing other things, and developing other programs.
but one of the things I'd really like to make sure we cover is the transition to Creative Scotland, because that was another unfortunate cause of instability and lack of strategic thinking and limbo and status, and it also was a huge. It kind of like a load of dice got rolled, and some people were big winners and some people were big losers, and it was fairly random. So how did that come about? Why did that come about?
Oh, was
that while you were there?
No. It's well after. I mean, while I was there.
Were the germs of that coming?
Kind of. Well, James Boyle kind of sat on this. He was the chairman, and then
there was some review.
Dipped out of chairman, and then got employed by the government to be the commissioner to do a review, and he came up with something like 140 recommendations, which we know that in reviews don't work like that. And there was a period of, I think it was also a period of political transition.
Yes.
Where nobody knew what to do with the Arts Council, and the SNP obviously wanted to do something, like change things when they got sufficient authority, because it was a minority administration to begin with.
Quite possibly, I can't remember.
Believe me, I was long gone, deeply embroiled in awful local authority politics in the west of England. So I didn't have much time to concentrate on what was going on in the Scotland that I loved but had left. But yeah, there was a hiatus of the most extreme. I think the hiatus must have been something like 4 or 5 years before anybody knew what was quite happening.
Well, not only
and
that,
in the meantime, people were setting out all kinds of bonkers strategies.
But there was this sort of flexible funding to try and cover the hiatus, and the way that happened was a bit of a. It was like totally random.
Well,
and there were some huge winners who did a great job, and there were some huge losers and total missed opportunities.
Well, yeah, I think that was all because everybody was at sea, and I certainly know at that time, during that period, that sort of hiatus, several friends and ex-colleagues, old friends and ex-colleagues from the Arts Council who were still there in Creative Scotland were tearing their hair out. They're doing, more than tearing their hair out, were deeply distressed by it, because it was all being, and then, you stripped out, there are no department funds anymore, it's all in one big fund. But then you had the officers, and I know this from talking to ex-colleagues, whose expertise was being completely wasted because they were having to do assessments on things they knew nothing about.
Yeah, well, it went crazy for a while, but that was after you left.
Yeah,
but
there was a smell of that in the air.
Yeah, it was like management, speak kind of.
Even before I left, we had kind of a couple of managers who were not specialists imposed above the art forms. So the art forms were already being told. We were told.
So specialist knowledge was getting downgraded in status.
And you know that 2 or 3 years ago, ECOS, the consultancy, did a review of music in Scotland for Creative Scotland.
Yeah.
Again, probably a bad timing, because it was finished at the time when there was a huge changeover in director of Creative Scotland, and everything again was suspended for a while, because that was a big crisis as well. We won't get into that, but so classically, the review that ECOS did, and they employed a couple of other people, myself and Judith Thackrell, to work on that. and we wrote it. And one of the things we were kind of warned off. Don't.
So
talk
you
about
did
the
a
structure
review
it.
of Creative Scotland after you left?
Of music
in Scotland. Right. Okay, that's interesting.
With reference to Creative Scotland, with recommendations. But we were told, because we literally delivered it in that hiatus period between directors and between.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, the people who were directing and running Creative Scotland from the outset, when it started to be Creative Scotland, didn't make a good job of it, and they, a few people left, right?
Yeah.
That's
not.
Rest,
I don't think
that's other history.
Controversial thing to say.
That's other history.
Yeah.
They did mess up,
Yeah.
including knocking on the head our touring programs, for instance,
Yeah.
and promising with a review of touring that never happened. Our review of music had to be restricted to music across the country, and had to. We were told not to give recommendations, but kind of serving suggestions. It's like that. But certainly in the parts about sector organisations and about the way the Arts Council should work was or Creative Scotland should work was, unless you have really respected expertise within the Arts Council, the sector will not respect you as a funder. They'll respect you better even if you're in conflict, if you have people there who know the scene. So that Ian Smith at that time, as the head of music, obviously he knew the sector inside out, backwards and forwards, and people couldn't argue with him about knowing the scene. And the fear was that you would downgrade the job into being like a screen watcher, a call centre person. And I think that I'm not speaking about Creative Scotland. I am speaking about Arts Council England. People with great expertise have been slightly downgraded and have spent much more time looking on screen at applications and marking people's exercise books rather than being developmental. But that was a danger in Scotland, because people were being ripped out of their specialism and told to review things that they knew nothing about.
So in a way, there's three big changes that kind of came in as you were leaving the Scottish Arts Council. Is this correct to say? Because this is what I think it's quite interesting to be clear about this. The first one,
downgrading of the art forms as
downgrading of specialist
force.
knowledge, and people with sector knowledge guiding management and being senior management is the first one.
So you had a kind of a senior management strata that weren't specifically art form people.
The second one was sort of moving away from a role where you're being strategic and trying to influence things and be more passive. So you're less proactive, more passive. You just see what the best applications are.
I'm sure people were being proactive, and I know that Ian Smith is being proactive, but kind of it's slightly against the tide to an extent.
Of course, I'm not saying that there weren't individuals being proactive. I mean, but the policy was that
policy was stand back and let the sector work itself out instead of being in.
So there weren't separate budgets. There was all one big budget. And it's sort of just general move towards one application form. Everybody, all art forms apply for the same pot of money. And there's a committee deciding.
Sort of.
And that's the way it is now. That's the way it is now.
And that's the way it went in England. Except when you realise. The Creative Scotland did a lot of sector reviews. Now I don't know what's happened to those sector reviews, because they've not come out as kind of sector strategies.
But why did those changes happen? Was it did somebody think it was better doing it that way?
Yes, because I remember a review taking place shortly before I was, an external review of the Arts Council by an external consultant, talking about silos. All the art forms are in their own silos.
What's a silo?
Silos are those things in farms.
I know that, but what does it mean in terms of...
What it means is they're self-contained, they're not connected with the rest.
And that's a bad thing?
That's meant to be a bad thing. However, here's the thing, and this is what really got to me, and really still irks me. We were told that we were all in silos. One of the joys, pleasures and enabling factors of being part of that group in the Scottish Arts Council was that I sat round and I listened to and respected the views of and tried to help where I could. The drama director, the literature director, all of the other art form people. We were collegiate. sure, we wanted to hustle a bit for our own areas, but we didn't fight each other. It wasn't like, you know, I'm going to fight Dharma because I want more of their money. We talked, we were collegiate. And I remember at one point where dance was not particularly well funded at the Arts Council. So they created a new department, a specific dance department, rather than it being merged with drama, and then a dance director. And we all sat around in one annual budget round and said, you know what, we're all going to hang back, put more money into dance this year. This was the collegiate view of the other art forms. So we were told that we were being sort of fighting in our own little world, and you know, we weren't. That's really made me cross.
And also, you knew what you were talking about.
Yeah. And
what your silo needed.
When my colleagues across the table talked about what their particular area of interest needed, I believed them and I listened to their expertise.
Yeah.
What's more, when we were dealing with cross art form organisations, art centres, you know, places like CCA and things like that, we could have a kind of a broad view. So that they were doing music in CCA, kind of experimental music and contemporary visual art and so on and so forth. So we could have a broad view of it, and you know, and bring in us, so I could help with the musical view of CCA and somebody else with the arts view. So actually, the collegiate nature of what we were doing was much healthier than splitting us up and putting some kind of higher management above us who were
business heads.
They might have been specialists, and but by and large they weren't.
Yeah.
And by and large they weren't even culture specialists.
Yes.
Which is
okay, so I'm aware of taking up a lot of your time, and I'm very grateful for you being so frank.
It's the fish and chips that worry me.
And I'm worried about that as well. But is there anything that you really want to talk about before we finish, that from your time at the Scottish Arts Council, that you want to just sort of mention, whether it's good or bad, or just,
well, I mean, my time at the Scottish Arts Council was one of the best times in my entire life, let alone my working career.
Yeah. Because you got to spend a lot of time with me, presumably.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. No, it's your sister I spent time. No, I did. I made more friends, had more of a relationship with music people across the board than I think I could possibly have done in any other circumstance, and it kind of obviously it strengthened my views about how I think strategic work in culture and the arts should happen. But also it taught me. I remember saying to my partner at the time, when the job was offered to me, oh, blimey, God, I got the job. God, blimey, because I've been freelance before then, as you know, and I said, I'm a bit frightened about this because there's lots of things I don't know about. But it would be like going to university, and it was. I learned more about music, the way the music works in terms of notation and composition and playing, but although I learnt a bit about that, but I learnt about how the music sector works.
Yeah.
I knew nothing about how opera companies worked, and I can probably give you a fair outline now. Orchestra's the same. The rock music scene, I knew nothing, and I contacted people and had lots of I began to understand the spectrum, and that was immensely exciting and invaluable, and I hope I was able to at least kind of contribute a bit of that knowledge back into, and see where the similarities and the differences were, you know.
Yeah.
So I mean I was very lucky. I had a time at the Arts Council when things were kind of going
Golden era. Golden era.
There is no such thing as the golden era, because that way lies. That's what Donald Trump's been saying, that we've, you know, there isn't that we want to get back to the golden era. It doesn't exist. What we had is certain circumstances that allowed.
Yeah,
more
there was a
open,
confluence of historical things and you know, but various things that were ready to burst in a positive way. But there was a bit. It seems to me the underlying sort of thinking and policy intentions of the funding body, to me, then there was a lot of really positive things about them, and the changes since then, I don't know if they've been positive.
I think the changes since then have become more and more, you know, more and more tied up with the fluctuation, endless fluctuation of political policy. As you know, the whole rubric about Arts Council Great Britain, when it started after the war, let alone now, was it's an arm's length body. It's a body that decides upon cultural policy in the country, but it's at arm's length from government. It gets the money from the government, but it does its own thing because we respect its non-political. I mean, essentially non-political connection. It's not a minister of culture.
Yes.
Which in France you would have, or in other countries you'd have. Frankly, they can be just as liberal, but it's meant to be separate from politics. It's about that separate from politics now, and everything that's happened. Certainly, I don't know. I think for many years now has been on the part of the funding bodies has been knee-jerk reaction to other circumstances rather than
what does the sector need, what does arts need?
Yeah, deeply committed. They will say that constantly, but if you look at it, I really think we've shifted from the more kind of let's take a view of the sector and see what it needs, which actually when the reviews that we've written, I did a review of Arts Council Northern Ireland's music in Northern Ireland as well some years ago. I was kind of happy that they did take on some of the recommendations. I was really pleased about that. But then they're a different kind of a outfit. It's a whole different scene there. But the proposition that you might actually, as a public body, want to strategically intervene or influence certain things in art form terms has gone away. The Arts Council of England, I'm sure in Creative Scotland, would say they're trying to influence things in different ways, like more access for people in certain circumstances, more diversity, all those kind of political and quite, I don't disagree.
Important things. They're not irrelevant.
No, that's right. But they're working on that level rather than saying, you know what, if we did such and such a thing with jazz music or with poetry and put money there and kind of we intervened a bit, then actually some things might happen.
Yeah.
It's a risky thing because you can intervene and mess things up, but at least you're taking some action instead of being
passive.
It's kind of a passive receptor of, like I said, a senior Arts Council England person. We don't give out grants, we receive applications. That's a positive, that's a big passive attitude.
Yeah.
We don't have a strategy about music, that person said to me. And I thought, well, might be a good idea to have one. It would have to fit with other factors and political factors, but it would be nice to say we're thinking about music in this kind of a way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Let's go and have some fish and chips, or you can have fish and chips and I'll go and have something else.
Yes, right.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. No, that's really interesting.
The one thing that everybody in the world gives freely and with great pleasure is their opinion.